Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. The past week has been an exciting time here in Singapore with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent visit to the city-state. Mr. Modi's fifth visit to Singapore marked a momentous occasion in Singapore-India relations as the two countries upgraded their strategic partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership that essentially means deeper bilateral cooperation over wider and newer sectors. To provide a deep insight into the nature of this partnership, joining me today is Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead for Trade and Economics Division here at ISAS. Welcome, Dr. Palit.
Thank you, Devyani. A pleasure to be on the show with you.
So, Dr. Palit, the recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to Singapore marks his fifth visit here since he came to power in 2018. This visit was momentous as the Singapore-India strategic partnership was upgraded to become a comprehensive strategic partnership. How do you view this change in the partnership and what does it encapsulate?
I think there are quite a few sides to this current elevation that has been announced, which are significant both from a bilateral as well as a regional perspective. Bilaterally, of course, I think we are reaching the 60th year of the anniversary of diplomatic relations between India and Singapore as sovereign independent nations, so which is quite a landmark, and it's appropriate that the elevation of the partnership has come on the eve of the 60th year. So it is kind of commensurate with the significance of the depth by which the relationship has traversed. On the other side, I think, as you mentioned, that Prime Minister Modi is not a stranger to Singapore, but he's coming back after quite a few years. It's interesting that he's coming back at a time when he has come back to office for the third term. It's been just 3 months now that he has been sworn into office. And Singapore has also had a change at the very top level of its leadership. So we have a new Prime Minister in Singapore now. So in that sense, it was probably a significant meeting between the two governments because this is beginning a new chapter. And to that extent, the announcement of a comprehensive strategic partnership, I think, is indicative of the fact that the India-Singapore relationship, which by and large has been a stable and solid partnership, is now being thought to be taken to another level. And when we say that another level, what I have personally on my mind is a wide range of cooperation. Till now, the cooperation has primarily been premised on economic relationship, and there were also regional issues on which both countries have worked together effectively. But I think today the comprehensive strategic partnership will bring into focus several areas of cooperation which both countries think are of mutual strategic value. And that, I think, will open a new era in the India-Singapore relations as we go ahead.
What do you think is the nature and significance of the India-Singapore partnership? You kind of alluded to it in your previous answer as well. But just so as to elaborate, because there has been regime change in both countries in terms of Singapore, we have a new prime minister here. And in case of India, there's been a continuation. But we see even with the budget this year that there have been significant changes. So keeping that in mind and the expansive foreign policy that India is adopting now, how do you think the nature of this partnership will be changing and why is it so significant at this point?
At one level, Devyani, I think it's important to note the fact that if we look back at the time when Prime Minister Modi came back to office for a third time and the kind of foreign engagements he has had since then, we see that quite a bit of it has been with respect to Southeast Asia. So, for example, the Malaysian Prime Minister visited India last month, and Prime Minister Modi made his first visit to Brunei while he came to Singapore also. So, which basically means that India is, in a sense, recalibrating its engagement with Southeast Asia. And we have had a fairly strong history behind this, which began from India's Lookist policy in the 1990s, which was upgraded to the Act East policy subsequently. And today, it's no more a question of looking at Southeast Asia in isolation, but looking at Southeast Asia as part of India's bigger focus on the Indo-Pacific region. But I ought also look at this in another way. I think the decade that we are now belonging to is a decade which has been fairly tumultuous in many respects. So we first had the COVID. Then thereafter, there have been sharp fissures in the global and regional order. So we see a lot of new partnerships growing across the world. And the Asia-Pacific region or the Indo-Pacific region or the region around Southeast Asia, which also brings in India into its economic and strategic geographical terrain, has actually become a bit more volatile as opposed to what it was earlier. Now, in all this, I think there is always a tendency of countries to forget who were actually the old partners and the consistent partners. The India-Southeast Asia relationship has been a consistent relationship for a very long time. And there have really not been areas of major disagreement or disruptions. But sometimes it is important to affirm that continuity. And I think Prime Minister Modi's visit marks a very important signal in that respect, that India remains committed to Southeast Asia. And within Southeast Asia, the primacy of Singapore as a partner remains undisputed. That does not mean that India is not going to engage effectively with other countries in Southeast Asia. And I have Malaysia, Indonesia, maybe even Thailand on my mind, or also Vietnam. But Singapore remains a kind of a unique point in India's variety of regional relationships. And we know the kind of importance that Singapore commands from an economic engagement partnership, from a people-to-people connectivity partnership. And I think, and we can discuss a little bit more on this, that I think there are several mechanisms which have been set up, which are very unique to the India-Singapore partnership at the G2G level, at the B2B level. And those really are the bulwark on the basis of which this relationship is proceeding.
Absolutely. I think you've touched upon certain key aspects of the India-Singapore relationship, most particularly talking about India's larger foreign policy outlook towards Singapore as part of Southeast Asia, and that comes under India's now Act East policy, which talks about further engagement in Southeast Asia and East Asia. In your opinion, how would the Singapore-India comprehensive partnership, this movement, further intensification of the relationship, would enable India's engagement with Southeast Asia? And how would Singapore in some ways act as a gateway to the region? Because there have been high level of hopes from the Indian side as well as from Singapore for India to become a critical player in the Indo-Pacific. So how does that play out?
Let me begin with the economic part first. And we know that Singapore is one of the largest sources of inward foreign direct investment into India. And Singapore and Mauritius tend to chop positions between themselves in terms of the number one spot. But when we look at Singapore's latest role in FDI into India, it's accounted for nearly about a quarter of the FDI that goes into India. And there are two parts to these foreign investments. The first is, of course, what is coming in from Singapore companies. And we see several prominent Singapore companies, including companies like Ascendas, SimCorp, the DBS Bank, the Capitaland, the Port Authority of Singapore, who are actively invested into India. And I shouldn't forget the Singapore Airlines as well. But there is another group of investments that flows into India from Singapore, which are basically reflective of the fact that Singapore remains one of the Asia Pacific's, if not the world's, best centers for mobilizing funds. So a lot of companies and enterprises who are based in the Asia Pacific region and want to move into India would actually look at incorporating themselves in Singapore as registered companies and raise resources while being registered in Singapore as companies and invest onward into India. I think this is pretty much actively happening in the startup space. This is also pretty much actively happening across the foreign institutional investor participation space. And just a while ago, we were referring to these unique partnerships that have happened across various ranges of cooperation. So let's say, for example, if we look at the way the stock exchanges in India and Singapore have been connected to each other, in the gift city in Gandhinagar. We know of the interoperability that has happened between PayNow and UPI in India. We know of the very active roles that Indian and Singapore banks are playing in each other's respective territories. Now, all these provide a very strong foundation for variety of investment and investment-related activities between the two countries. So if that is the economic foundation on the basis of which we are looking at the comprehensive strategic partnership, the next part that comes into it is, I think, what has been outlined through the various MOUs that was signed between the Prime Minister's visit. So if we identify these 4 key areas on which the MOUs came, the first was semiconductors, followed by digital economy, then health, and then finally skills and education. I think all these 4 sectors in a way have a commonality. They have the commonality that these are the 4 sectors which would be among those which define the abilities of countries in future to hold strategic influence in the world. Because countries, with respect to their positions in terms of contributing to these sectors, will be able to command a significant weight in the global conversations and global economic contributions as we go ahead. So we all know how important semiconductors are, from top to bottom, the importance of semiconductors. We know the great importance of education, and particularly education not just in terms of a particular variety of education, but education across all spheres, and particularly that which can be connected to the digital transformation. And that's where the digital connectivity and the digital economy comes in. And finally, healthcare. And the importance of healthcare was first brought to our notice very sharply during COVID. We have seen the kind of partnership that India and Singapore had on that occasion. But subsequently thereafter, I think health remains a very major area of cooperation. And this is why not just a question of, the engagement that comes in R&D or supply of medicines. It's also in health care, where the role of human resources becomes extremely important. The role of nurses, the role of caregivers, the role of doctors, pathological testing, and so on and so forth. And that's where I think, unknown to many of us, there's actually a lot of collaboration that has been happening between India and Singapore for a very long time. And now these MOUs signal the lifting of that collaboration into their next phase of advancement. And we are pretty much sure in one respect that what India and Singapore have been able to work out between themselves can actually work as a template, in terms of future models of collaboration that Singapore will be looking at with respect to other economies in Asia, and similarly what India will be looking forward to with respect to other economies in the Indo-Pacific.
I think you have very well laid down the map work and understanding between the comprehensive strategic partnership between Singapore and India. I think my next question was about the 4 MOUs, and I think I'll still go ahead and ask a little bit more on it. So as the 4 memorandum of understandings between the two countries pointed towards cooperation in semiconductors, digital technology, skills in education, and healthcare, we do know that a lot of work is already being done where it comes to digital technology, where you see financial payment services being sort of brought together on the same platform, where you have UPI and PayNow kind of becoming interoperable. There is also a lot of work that has been done in healthcare, and you've pointed to that in your previous response. What is interesting is to understand exactly the strategic motive behind it, and I think you've put it very well when you talk about how this is something that is important for strategic influence. But my question is more on, what do you think would be the scope of growth for this partnership? How do we see further cooperation in semiconductors. There has been talk about investment by Singaporean firms into India. But what could basically, if you could just give us a prediction of what roadmap this partnership would take in, say, medium term, say 5 to 10 years, or if you could give us an understanding of what sort of growth these kind of partnerships could have. Because if this is the template that India is going to be using, it would be interesting to see what its strategic goals are and how it is intending to get there. And most importantly, what are Singapore's motives when it comes to these MOUs as well?
I think there's one point that we sometimes overlook, that when we look at relationships or partnerships between countries, we tend to look at them through somewhat narrow prisms. Let's say, for example, security partnerships or economic partnerships in isolation of each other. But what we probably overlook is the fact that ultimately relationships between countries are actually relationships between their people. And when we look at the way this comprehensive economic strategic partnership or the broader strategic partnership has been worked out, and when we look at the MOUs that have been signed, say for example education, skills, healthcare, digital economy, even semiconductors, these are all people-oriented sectors. And by themselves, these are sectors which are going to create enormous opportunities for people-to-people connectivity between India and Singapore. If we look at it from the India perspective, the countries which are really India's strong, durable, long-term partners, so for example, a country like the United States or a country like the United Arab Emirates or even UK, these are countries with whom India's people-to-people connectivity is robust, and that people-to-people connectivity is linked through the sectors through which these countries are engaging with India. So that could be in security, that could be in science and technology, that could be in social sciences and humanities, education, healthcare, and a variety of other sectors. So they could be based out of business, they could be based out of social communication, that could be based out of cultural entertainment communication. In all these respects, I think Singapore is the only country in the Asia Pacific which kind of resonates that particular model that India has on its west with certain countries in terms of the depth of the relationship and where the people are involved very actively. So, for example, when you look at the number of flights that connect Singapore to various cities of India, the number is actually staggering. Now, the question is that why are so many flights necessary? They are necessary because people are traveling between the two countries. Why they are traveling is a different question. Obviously, everybody has different reasons for traveling, but those reasons cut across leisure, holiday, business, medical, education, all sectors. So it's a multifarious relationship. I think that makes this India-Singapore partnership very unique. And when we look at the kind of people that have now become a part of this relationship, including the examples that we get with respect to Singapore and India's engagement in skills development, for example. The World Skills Center, which has been set up by Singapore's ITE in Odisha, and the internship which the trainees from there are getting in Singapore, who are actually present on the occasion of the PM's visit, and they came and met them, and the role that, let's say, for example, the Tatas are playing in terms of bringing skills on both sides, private industries, businesses, technical training providers. This is actually very unique, and we don't see that happening between many partnerships that India has, except one or two countries, as I mentioned. Maybe the United States to some extent, maybe the UK, but those are old historical connections. Whereas Singapore is a story that has unfolded over the last 30 to 35 years. And the pace at which those connections have advanced is remarkable. So I think that's something which is very noteworthy.
I think that almost makes them seem like natural and obvious partners.
Natural and organic partners, if one can define it that way.
Actually, that is quite true. Anyway, so the proximity between both the countries has also been noticed in several multilateral frameworks, especially with India's special invitation to Singapore during its G20 presidency in 2023. How do you view this economic and strategic partnership to be playing out in an era where geopolitical competition is rising in the Indo-Pacific? And especially at multilateral formats such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, how do these partnerships play out over multilateral frameworks?
I think that's a very important question that you asked, Devyani, because one of the challenges of coexistence in the modern world at a time when the relationships are facing increasing pressure of fracturing is the point that countries need to reassure each other about their intentions and the fact that exogenous developments outside their bilateral sphere are not going to impact the core of their partnerships. That's very important. So we know what has been going on around us. We know about the tensions in the South China Sea, for example, the issues that have surfaced around Taiwan, the broader China plus one strategy, the United States-China major power competition. We are aware of all these things. Now, it's impossible to think that there will not be any, even tertiary effect of these in the strategic plannings of the countries all around, because countries like United States, China and others are so big and so omnipresent in various sectors of global operations that you can't really wish them away. So that becomes an important factor for a country like India, that becomes an equally important factor for a country like Singapore. But what really matters in this respect is the fact that there needs to be very well-established channels of bilateral communication through which you can communicate to each other that there are areas where countries act according to their specific national interests. Those do not defray the basic relationship and the foundation that exists between the two countries. So you have between India and Singapore, there's very unique, lines of communication. For example, the India-Singapore Ministerial Roundtable, which has been set up some 2 to 3 years ago, and which is actually unique in the sense that we have 4 very senior ministers from India who were in Singapore a week before the Prime Minister came, and they met their counterparts from the Singapore side, and that kind of a framework itself is a huge confidence building measure. The way we define CBMs, it itself is a major CBM because it helps in clearing a lot of lines of grey communication between the countries and improves the understanding on a large number of matters. And in addition to that, we have several what we would typically call the track 1.5 lines of communication, including, for example, the India-Singapore bilateral strategic dialogue, in which the Institute of South Asian Studies itself is involved as a major facilitator, and between the businesses. So we have the India-Singapore Business Roundtable as well. So all these lines of communication, I think, are institutional mechanisms. They have become so over the years that they have been functioning. The ISMR, for example, doesn't have a long history, but it's become a very important channel of communication between the two countries, which ensures that both India and Singapore are conscious about the fact that it doesn't matter what happens elsewhere. They have a space which is very unique to their bilateral relationship, and both value this bilateral relationship very highly. So as a result of that, they are keen on maintaining and preserving that organic content of their relationship and ensure that it doesn't get damaged in any respect by what has been happening around in the rest of the world, number one. Number two, they between themselves are able to collaborate as extensively as possible on areas of mutual interest. So for example, clean economy, climate change and fighting climate change, healthcare. These remain areas of equal concern for both countries. So it cannot be a case that what is happening outside of their relationship will become a deterrent in their collaboration on these areas. So I think that's the trust and the understanding which this comprehensive partnership brings to the table.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palit. I think this has been quite a learning episode for me, and I'm guessing it would be the same for anybody listening to this podcast. Thank you so much again. This really brings to light the different aspects of India-Singapore relations, how it is organic in certain regards, and how people-to-people relationship is still the center of the bilateral relationship, and how Prime Minister Modi's recent visit sort of re-symbolized India's support to Singapore. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for hosting me.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.